It was a hot, sticky afternoon on a quiet country road. The kind of day where the sun feels like it's sitting right on top of you, and the air is so thick you could almost drink it. Officer Michael Thompson sat behind the wheel of his patrol car, sweat trickling down his neck as he drove along the empty stretch. He wasn't in any particular hurry, just another routine check of the area. But then, out of nowhere, the engine started sputtering. A few coughs, a groan, and suddenly the car came to a dead stop. Michael sighed, leaning back against the seat for a moment. "Of course this happens now," he muttered under his breath. There wasn't another soul in sight, just fields stretching endlessly on either side of the road. No cell service either. He'd checked twice already. With no other choice, he stepped out of the car, wiping his forehead with the sleeve of his uniform. The heat hit him like a wall as soon as he opened the door. It was one of those days when even breathing felt like work. He popped the hood, hoping maybe it was something simple, like a loose wire or an overheated radiator. But as he peered into the tangled mess of metal and hoses, he realized he didn't have a clue what he was looking at. Cars weren't exactly his strong suit. Just as he was starting to feel more frustrated than ever, he heard footsteps crunching on gravel behind him. Turning around, he saw an older man walking toward him. The man looked like he'd been working outside all day. His overalls were faded and streaked with dirt, and his hands were calloused. His face was lined with age, but his eyes were sharp, full of life and kindness. Something about him immediately put Michael at ease. "Car trouble?" the man asked, stopping a few feet away. His voice was deep and warm, carrying a hint of wisdom that only comes with years of experience. "Yeah," Michael replied, gesturing toward the open hood. "I'm not really sure what's wrong with it. I don't know much about cars." The man chuckled softly. "Well, lucky for you, I do. Let me take a look. Let me." Without waiting for permission, he walked over and leaned into the engine bay, inspecting everything carefully. After a moment, he nodded to himself. "Looks like your alternator belt's gone bad. Easy fix if we can get the right tools." Michael blinked in surprise. "You're willing to help? Just like that?" The man straightened up, giving him a small smile. "What else am I gonna do? Leave you stranded out here? Besides, helping people is what I do." He extended a hand. "Name's Henry Johnson, by the way." "Michael Thompson," Michael said, shaking his hand firmly. "And thanks. Really, I appreciate it." Henry waved off the gratitude. "Don't mention it. Now let's see if we can't get this thing running again." As they worked together, pulling out tools from Henry's old toolbox and tinkering under the hood, they fell into easy conversation. Michael learned that Henry lived nearby, in a small house surrounded by wildflowers and vegetable gardens. He spent most of his days fixing things, cars, fences, whatever needed attention. He seemed content with his simple life, happy to lend a hand wherever he could. For his part, Henry listened intently as Michael talked about his job as a police officer. Michael explained how he'd always wanted to serve his community, how being a cop gave him a sense of purpose. He mentioned growing up in foster care after losing his mom at a young age, though he didn't go into too much detail. Talking about his past still made him uncomfortable even after all these years. But there was something about Henry that made Michael want to open up. Maybe it was the way the older man carried himself, with patience and understanding. Or maybe it was the genuine interest he showed in every word Michael said. Whatever it was, Michael found himself sharing more than he usually would. At one point, while tightening a bolt, Henry glanced over at him. "So, what about your dad? You said you lost your mom when you were little. What about your father?" Michael hesitated, his fingers pausing on the wrench. "I never knew him," he admitted quietly. He left before I was born. Mom never talked about him much. All I know is that I ended up in foster care after she passed." Henry nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. For a split second, Michael thought he saw something flash across the older man's face. Sadness, maybe, or recognition. But before he could ask, Henry turned back to the car, focusing on the task at hand. Despite the nagging feeling that something was off, Michael pushed it aside. They had a car to fix after all. And besides, Henry seemed nice enough. If anything, he reminded Michael of the kind of person he wished he'd had in his life growing up. Someone steady, dependable, someone who stuck around. Little did either of them know their chance meeting on that dusty country road was about to change both their lives forever. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the dirt road, Michael and Henry worked side by side under the hood of the patrol car. The rhythmic clinking of tools against metal filled the air, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter or thoughtful pauses in their conversation. Despite the heat still clinging stubbornly to the afternoon, there was a strange comfort in the shared effort. It felt almost natural, like they'd done this kind of thing before, not just fixing cars, but connecting over something bigger. Henry had a way of making small talk feel meaningful without even trying. He asked questions that seemed casual at first, but each one carried a little weight, nudging Michael to think deeper about his answers. "So, what made you decide to become a cop?" Henry asked as he tightened a bolt with steady hands. Michael leaned back on his heels, wiping grease off his fingers onto his uniform pants. "I guess it's because I wanted to help people," he said after a moment. "Growing up, I didn't have much stability. Moving from one foster home to another wasn't easy. But through all of that, I always admired the cops who showed up when things got tough. They were dependable, you know? Like no matter how bad things got, they'd be there." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the engine, but clearly listening, intently. "That's noble," he said softly. "Helping folks, it's not an easy job. Takes guts, patience, and heart." There was a warmth in his voice that made Michael glance up. For a brief second, he thought he saw pride flickering in Henry's expression, though it vanished so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined it. "Yeah, well, I try my best," Michael replied, shrugging modestly. Then, after a pause, he added, "But honestly, part of it was also about finding some kind of purpose. You know, growing up without parents and it leaves a hole. Being a cop gives me a sense of belonging, like I'm part of something bigger than myself." Henry froze for a fraction of a second, his hand hovering midair above the alternator belt. When he finally moved again, his motions were deliberate, almost too careful. "Parents, huh?" he murmured, more to himself than to Michael. After a beat, he cleared his throat and looked up. "What about your dad? Do you remember anything about him?" The question caught Michael off guard. He straightened up, resting his arms on the edge of the open hood while staring out at the empty fields beyond. "Not really," he admitted. "Like I told you earlier, he left before I was born. Mom didn't talk about him much, just that he wasn't around anymore. I don't even know his name. All I've got is her last name, which I kept until I was adopted." Henry's grip on the wrench tightened slightly, though Michael didn't notice. Instead, he went on, lost in memories he rarely let himself revisit. "When I was younger, I used to imagine what he might have been like. Was he tall? Did he laugh a lot? Did he love music like I do? But eventually I stopped wondering. It hurt too much to think about someone who didn't want me enough to stick around." There was a heaviness in his voice now, a raw vulnerability that tugged at Henry's chest. He lowered the tool in his hand, letting it rest gently on the ground beside him. For a long moment he didn't say anything. His mind raced with thoughts he'd buried years ago. Thoughts of a young woman holding a newborn baby. Thoughts of promises broken and chances lost. Finally, he spoke, his tone softer than before. "Sometimes people leave not because they don't care, but because they're scared. Scared of failing, scared of not being good enough. That doesn't mean they stop loving, though. Love can stay alive even when distance grows between two people." Michael frowned, tilting his head slightly as he studied Henry's face. There was something in those words, a depth, a weight, that didn't quite match the light-hearted banter they'd shared earlier. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," he said cautiously. Henry chuckled, though it lacked humor. "Let's just say I've seen my share of mistakes and regrets. Life has a funny way of teaching lessons we don't always want to learn." Before Michael could press further, Henry changed the subject, nodding toward the car. "Looks like we're almost done here." Give me a minute to double-check everything and then we'll see if she fires up. Reluctantly, Michael dropped the topic, though the unanswered questions lingered in the back of his mind. As Henry fiddled with the final adjustments, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this man than met the eye. There was a sadness in his eyes, a quiet ache that hinted at a story untold. And yet, despite the mystery surrounding him, Michael found himself trusting Henry instinctively. Maybe it was the kindness in his actions, or maybe it was something deeper, something he couldn't quite put into words. Once the repairs were complete, Henry stood up, brushing dirt off his hands. "All right, give it a shot," he said, motioning toward the driver's seat. Michael climbed in and turned the key. The engine roared to life, smooth and steady. Relief washed over him, followed by gratitude. "You're a lifesaver," he said, stepping out of the car to shake Henry's hand once more. "I owe you big time." Henry waved off the thanks with a dismissive smile. "Don't worry about it, just glad I could help." As they packed up the tools and closed the hood, Michael glanced at Henry thoughtfully. "Hey, where do you live? I should at least drive you back home after all this." Henry hesitated, glancing down the road as if weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "Sure, why not? My place isn't far from here." The ride back was quieter than before, both men lost in their own thoughts. Michael drove slowly, stealing glances at Henry seated beside him. There was so much he wanted to ask, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Yet for reasons he couldn't explain, he held his tongue. Something told him the answers would come in time, if Henry was willing to share them. Went Sutter. They reached a modest house surrounded by wildflowers swaying gently in the breeze. Michael parked the car and turned to Henry. "Thanks again for everything. Seriously, I don't know what I would have done without your help today." Henry smiled faintly, his gaze lingering on Michael for a moment longer than necessary. "You never know who might cross your path," he said cryptically. "Sometimes, people show up exactly when you need them most." With that, he stepped out of the car and started walking toward his front door, leaving Michael sitting there, puzzled but intrigued. As he watched Henry disappear inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that their encounter was far from over. The next morning, Michael woke up with a restless energy he couldn't quite shake. He'd tossed and turned all night, replaying the events of the previous day over and over in his mind. It wasn't just the car trouble or the sweltering heat that stuck with him, it was Henry. There was something about the man that didn't sit right, not in a bad way, but in a way that made Michael feel like there was more beneath the surface. The cryptic things Henry had said, the way he'd looked at Michael when they talked about family, it all felt too deliberate to be coincidence. By the time breakfast rolled around, Michael had already decided what he needed to do. He couldn't let it go. Something inside him, a gut feeling, maybe even curiosity, was telling him to dig deeper. So after finishing his coffee and grabbing a notebook from his desk, he hopped into his patrol car and headed back toward the quiet country road where he'd met Henry. When he pulled up to the modest house surrounded by wildflowers, Michael hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car. The place looked peaceful, almost untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Chickens pecked lazily at the ground near the fence, and the faint scent of blooming flowers drifted through the air. For a second, Michael wondered if he was making a mistake. What if Henry thought he was being nosy? But then again, how could he ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to their meeting than met the eye? Taking a deep breath, Michael walked up to the porch and knocked on the wooden door. A few seconds passed before he heard slow, steady footsteps approaching from inside. When the door creaked open, Henry stood there looking surprised but not unwelcoming. His overalls were clean this time, and he held a mug of tea in one hand. "Well, this is unexpected," Henry said with a small smile, leaning against the doorframe. "Didn't think I'd see you so soon." Michael rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Yeah, sorry to drop by unannounced. I wanted to thank you again for yesterday. You really saved me." Henry waved off the gratitude with a dismissive gesture. "No need to thank me twice, son. Helping folks is what I do." The word son caught Michael off guard, sending a strange shiver down his spine. He forced a smile, trying to brush it off. Still, I appreciate it, and well. He paused, searching for the right words. I guess I'm curious about you. Henry raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. Curious? About an old man like me? Yeah, Michael admitted, chuckling nervously. You seem like someone with stories to tell. Plus, some of the things you said yesterday got me thinking, like about parents and choices and all that. For a moment, Henry didn't respond. He simply stared at Michael, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he stepped aside and motioned for Michael to come in. All right, have a seat, he said, gesturing toward a worn couch in the living room. If you're here for stories, I reckon I've got a few. Michael followed him inside, taking in the cozy yet simple surroundings. The furniture was old but well kept, and shelves lined the walls filled with books and framed photographs. As he sat down on the couch, Henry disappeared into the kitchen, returning a minute later with 2 cups of tea. Handing one to Michael, he settled into a chair across from him. So, Henry began, sipping his tea slowly. What exactly are you curious about? Michael hesitated, unsure where to start. Finally, he blurted out, Your life, your past, everything. Henry chuckled softly, shaking his head. That's a tall order, son. My life's been long and complicated. Not sure you've got the patience for all of it. I do, Michael insisted, surprising even himself with how earnest he sounded. Look, I don't know why, but I feel like there's something, important about you. Like we're connected somehow. Henry froze, the mug halfway to his lips. His eyes locked onto Michael's, searching for something, truth maybe, or courage. After a long pause, he set the mug down on the side table and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. You're sharper than you look, he said quietly. All right, I'll tell you my story. But fair warning, it ain't pretty and it might leave you with more questions than answers. Michael nodded, bracing himself. Whatever Henry was about to say, he knew it would change everything. Henry took a deep breath, staring at the floor as if gathering his thoughts. A long time ago, he began, his voice low and steady. I lived in Detroit. Back then, I was young and foolish, full of dreams that never quite came true. Met a woman there. She was beautiful, smart, and kind. We fell in love fast, faster than either of us expected. Before we knew it, she was pregnant. He paused, swallowing hard. But life wasn't easy for us. Money was tight and I panicked. I convinced myself I wasn't ready to be a father, that I'd mess it all up somehow. So instead of staying and fighting for my family, I ran. Left her alone with a baby on the way, thinking I was doing the right thing. Michael's chest tightened as he listened, the pieces starting to fall into place. He wanted to interrupt, to ask questions, but something told him to stay quiet and let Henry finish. I regretted it almost immediately. Henry continued, his voice cracking slightly. Tried going back, but by the time I returned to Detroit, she was gone. Moved away, they said. Took the baby with her. I searched everywhere, asked everyone I could find, but no one knew where she'd gone. Eventually, I gave up. Figured I'd lost my chance forever. Tears welled up in Henry's eyes, though he blinked them away quickly. Years went by, and I tried to move on. Built a new life for myself here. Kept busy fixing things and helping people. But every single day I wondered about them. Wondered if my boy grew up safe, happy, loved. Wondered if he ever thought about the father who left him behind. The room fell silent, heavy with unspoken emotions. Michael stared at Henry, his heart pounding in his chest. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he reached for the notebook he'd brought with him and flipped it open to a blank page. What was her name? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Your wife? The mother of your child? Henry hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. Then with a sigh, he whispered, Anna. Her name was Anna. Michael scribbled the name down, his hands trembling slightly. Without another word, he tore the page from the notebook and folded it carefully, tucking it into his pocket. Somewhere deep inside, he already knew the truth. but hearing it aloud would make it real and irreversible. Henry watched him closely, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Why does that matter to you?" he asked softly. Michael looked up, meeting Henry's gaze head-on. "Because," he said, his voice steady now, "my mom's name was Anna and I was born in Detroit." The room fell silent after Michael's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Henry sat frozen, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His eyes widened, darting between Michael's face and the notebook tucked into his pocket. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The only sound was the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall, each second stretching out longer than the last. Finally, Henry broke the silence, his voice barely audible. "What did you say?" Michael leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His heart was racing, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I said my mom's name was Anna, and I was born in Detroit." Henry stared at him, his expression unreadable. It was as if he were trying to piece together some invisible puzzle, searching for any detail that might prove this wasn't real, that it couldn't possibly be true. But deep down, he already knew. Something about the way Michael looked at him, the tone of his voice, the questions he'd asked, it all lined up perfectly with the story Henry had just told. "Anna," Henry whispered, almost to himself. He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. When he opened them again, they were filled with tears. She gave you up, didn't she? After she left Detroit?" Michael nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. She struggled to take care of me on her own. My foster parents told me she loved me enough to make sure I had a better life. They said she worked 2 jobs just to keep food on the table, but it wasn't enough. Eventually, she made the hardest decision of her life and gave me up for adoption." Henry's shoulders sagged under the weight of the revelation. He covered his face with his hands, shaking his head slowly. "Oh, Anna," he murmured, his voice cracking. "You always were stronger than me." For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The enormity of what had just happened settled over them like a heavy blanket. Michael watched as Henry fought back tears, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. It was clear this wasn't easy for him. Decades of guilt, regret, and longing had finally caught up, and now he was face to face with the son he never thought he'd see again. When Henry finally looked up, his eyes were red but resolute. "How old are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. 32, Michael replied. "Why?" Henry nodded, doing the math in his head. 32 years ago, he'd been young and scared, running away from responsibility instead of facing. 32 years ago, Anna had been left alone to raise their child. And now here they were, sitting across from each other, brought together by fate or maybe something even greater. "I don't know what to say," Henry admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I've spent half my life wondering about you, hoping you were okay, wondering if you ever thought about me. And now," he gestured toward Michael, his hand shaking slightly. "Now you're sitting right here, and I don't even know where to begin." Michael leaned back against the couch, letting out a long breath. This whole situation felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But it wasn't fiction. It was real. The man sitting across from him, the one who'd fixed his car and shared stories about love and loss, was his father. The same man who'd walked away before Michael was even born was now looking at him with a mixture of awe and sorrow. "You don't have to say anything right now," Michael said softly. "We've got time." Henry shook his head, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "No, I do. I owe you that much. You deserve to hear everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly." He stood up abruptly, pacing the room as he gathered his thoughts. Michael stayed quiet, giving him space to process. Finally, Henry stopped near the bookshelf, picking up a dusty photo album from one of the shelves. He flipped it open to a page, near the middle, and handed it to Michael. "This is her," he said, pointing to a faded photograph. In the picture, a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile held a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and despite the grainy quality of the photo, Her beauty shone through. Michael stared at the image, his throat tightening. He'd seen pictures of his mother before, but none quite like this. None that captured her so vividly, so alive. "That's her," he whispered, tracing the edge of the photo with his finger. "That's Anna. And this." Henry pointed to the baby in her arms. "That's you." A lump formed in Michael's throat as he realized what he was looking at. This wasn't just a picture of his mother. It was proof that he'd been loved even before he could remember. Even when life had been hard, Anna had held him close, smiling into the camera as if nothing else mattered. "I kept this album all these years," Henry explained, sitting back down beside Michael. "Every time I doubted whether you were okay, I'd look at these pictures and remind myself that you were out there somewhere, living your life. I wanted to believe you were happy." Michael closed the album gently, setting it aside. He turned to face Henry, his emotions swirling beneath the surface. Anger, sadness, confusion. They were all there, battling for attention. But above all, he felt a strange sense of relief, like finding the missing piece of a puzzle he hadn't known was incomplete. "Why didn't you come back?" he asked finally, his voice steady but tinged with pain. "If you cared so much, why didn't you try harder to find us?" Henry flinched at the question, guilt flashing across his face. "I did try, son. At first I searched everywhere. I went to every address I could think of, asked everyone I knew. But no one had answers. After a while I convinced myself that maybe it was better this way, that you were better off without me. I thought I'd only mess things up if I came back. But you didn't know that," Michael pressed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "You didn't give yourself a chance to make things right." "I know," Henry admitted, his voice breaking. "And I'll regret that choice for the rest of my life. Leaving was the biggest mistake I ever made. But I'm here now, Michael. If you'll let me, I want to be part of your life. Not because I deserve it, but because you deserve to know where you came from." The room grew quiet again, the tension between them palpable. Michael stared at his hands, wrestling with conflicting feelings. Part of him wanted to lash out, to demand answers for the years they'd lost. Another part, a bigger part, felt a flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start over. After what felt like an eternity, Michael looked up and met Henry's gaze. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's start from here. But fair warning, I've got a lot of questions." Henry smiled faintly, a glimmer of relief breaking through the sadness. "Ask away, son. I've got a lot of answers." Over the next few weeks, Michael and Henry spent countless hours together, slowly piecing together the decades they'd lost. Their conversations weren't always easy. There were moments of tension, raw emotion, and even silence, but each meeting brought them closer. It was like building a bridge between two worlds that had been separated for far too long, and while neither of them could turn back time, they both realized they had something precious, a second chance. One evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Michael found himself sitting on Henry's porch once again. This time, though, things felt different. There was an unspoken understanding between them now, a fragile but growing bond that neither wanted to break. The wildflowers swayed gently in the breeze, and the chickens clucked lazily nearby, creating a peaceful backdrop for what promised to be another deep conversation. Henry leaned back in his chair, sipping from a glass of lemonade he'd made earlier. "You know," he said after a pause, "I never thought I'd see this day. Never imagined I'd get to sit here with you, talking like we've known each other all our lives." Michael nodded, swirling the ice cubes in his own glass. "I feel the same way. Growing up, I used to wonder about you, what kind of person you were, why you left. Sometimes I thought maybe you didn't care. Other times I told myself there must have been a reason." Henry sighed heavily, setting his glass down on the small wooden table beside him. "There was a reason, though it wasn't a good one. Fear. Plain and simple. I was scared of failing you, of not being enough. So instead of staying and trying, I ran. That decision haunts me every single day." Michael glanced at him, studying. The lines etched into his face, the wrinkles that spoke of years filled with hard work, regret, and resilience. He wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the bitterness he'd carried for so long. But looking at Henry now, seeing the genuine remorse in his eyes, it was hard to cling to those feelings. "I won't lie," Michael said finally. "It still hurts. Knowing you walked away before I was even born, it's tough to wrap my head around, but I can tell you're sorry. And honestly, I think that matters more than anything else." Henry looked at him, his expression softening. "Thank you for saying that. I don't expect forgiveness overnight, or ever, really. All I want is to make things right, even if it's just a little bit at a time." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fireflies begin to dance across the yard. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine. It was one of those rare moments where everything seemed to align perfectly, where the past didn't weigh quite so heavily and the future felt full of possibility. Eventually, Michael broke the quiet. "Tell me more about Mom, about Anna. What was she like?" The question caught Henry off guard, but only for a moment. A small smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as memories flooded back. "She was amazing," he said softly. "Stronger than anyone I've ever known. She had this laugh that could light up a room, and when she smiled, it felt like the whole world stopped spinning for a second." He paused, chuckling softly to himself. She loved music, used to hum tunes while she cooked or cleaned. Said it kept her going on the hardest days. And she was smart, so smart. Always reading books, teaching herself new things. I used to joke that she should have been the teacher, not me. Michael listened intently, soaking in every word. He'd heard stories about his mother before, mostly from his foster parents, but hearing them from Henry felt different. It was like getting a glimpse into a part of her life he'd never known existed. "Do you remember any specific songs she liked?" Michael asked, his curiosity piqued. "Oh, sure," Henry replied, nodding. "She loved Motown, Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, Aretha Franklin, you name it. She knew the lyrics by heart. On weekends, she'd put on records and dance around the apartment. Made me join her sometimes, though I wasn't nearly as graceful." Michael laughed, imagining the scene. For the first time, he could picture his mother not just as the woman who gave him up out of love, but as a real person, with dreams, quirks, and passions. It was comforting in a way he hadn't expected. As the night wore on, their conversation shifted to lighter topics. They talked about hobbies, favorite foods, and childhood memories. Michael shared stories about growing up in foster care, the challenges he faced, and the people who helped shape him into the man he was today. Henry listened intently, nodding along and occasionally chiming in with advice or encouragement. At one point, Michael mentioned how much he enjoyed fixing things: cars, appliances, anything mechanical. "Guess I get that from you," he said, with a grin. "You saved my patrol car without breaking a sweat. Wish I had your skills." Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, you've got talent. Just takes practice. If you want, I'll teach you a few tricks. We can work on projects together." The idea lit a spark in Michael's chest. Spending time with Henry doing something hands-on sounded perfect. It would give them a chance to connect in a way words alone couldn't. "I'd like that," he said earnestly. By the time the stars began to dot the sky, Michael knew it was time to head home. He stood up, stretching his legs and brushing off his jeans. "Thanks for tonight," he said, turning to Henry. "For sharing all of this with me." Henry rose from his chair, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "No, thank you. For giving me a chance to be part of your life. I won't take it for granted, son. Not ever." As Michael drove away, he couldn't help but feel a sense of hope blossoming inside him. Yes, the road ahead wouldn't be easy. They still had wounds to heal and trust to rebuild, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged somewhere. Like he finally understood where he came from and maybe, just maybe, where he was headed. Back on the porch, Henry watched the taillights of Michael's car disappear down the road. Tears welled up in his eyes, but this time, they weren't tears of regret. They were tears of gratitude for the son he'd found, for the family he'd rediscovered, and for the promise of a brighter tomorrow. Weeks turned into months, and the bond between Michael and Henry grew stronger with each passing day. What had started as an accidental meeting on a dusty country road had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined. A relationship built on forgiveness, understanding, and love. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were moments when old wounds resurfaced or unanswered questions lingered in the air. But through it all, they held on to one simple truth. They'd been given a rare gift, the chance to rewrite their story. One crisp autumn afternoon, Michael arrived at Henry's house carrying a toolbox and a grin. "Ready for our first project?" he asked, stepping onto the porch. Over the past few weeks, they'd talked about working on cars together. But today was the day they'd finally make it happen. Henry chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. "You sure you're ready? Fixing engines isn't exactly like putting together furniture." "I'll take my chances," Michael replied, setting the toolbox down with a thud. "Besides, I've got the best teacher around." The two men spent the rest of the afternoon tinkering with an old truck Henry had picked up at a garage sale. The vehicle was rusty and barely running, but Henry saw potential in it, and so did Michael. As they worked side by side, grease-streaked hands turning wrenches and loosening bolts, their laughter echoed across the yard. For those few hours, everything else faded away. The weight of the past, the uncertainties of the future. It was just them, sharing something meaningful. At one point, while adjusting a stubborn part under the hood, Michael glanced over at Henry. "You know, this feels kind of symbolic," he said thoughtfully. "What does?" Henry asked, raising an eyebrow. "This whole thing, fixing this truck. It's like what we're doing with our relationship, taking something broken and making it whole again." Henry paused, his expression softening. "That's a good way to put it, son. Life throws its share of dents and scratches, but with patience and effort, most things can be repaired." Michael nodded, returning his focus to the engine. There was no need for more words. The sentiment hung in the air, solid and true. As winter approached, their connection deepened even further. Michael began spending weekends at Henry's house, helping him tend to the garden, repair fences, and organize the cluttered shed out back. In return, Henry taught Michael skills he'd never learned growing up: how to sharpen tools, build sturdy shelves, and even cook hearty meals from scratch. Each task brought them closer, filling gaps left empty for decades. One chilly Saturday evening, as they sat by the fireplace sipping hot cocoa, Michael broached a topic that had been on his mind for a while. "Do you ever think Mom would approve of us being here together like this?" Henry stared into the flames, his eyes reflecting the flickering light. "Every day," he said softly. "She loved you more than anything, Michael. If she could see us now, I know she'd be proud." Michael smiled, feeling warmth spread through his chest. Though Anna wasn't physically present, her influence lingered in every shared memory, every story Henry told, every lesson passed down. She was the invisible thread tying them together, guiding them toward healing. By spring, word of their reunion had spread throughout the small community. Neighbors who'd known Henry for years stopped by to congratulate him, marveling at the transformation they saw in both men. Where once there had been loneliness, now there was joy. Friends invited them to barbecues, church gatherings, and town events, eager to welcome Michael into the fold. One sunny Sunday afternoon during a local festival, Michael stood beside Henry as they watched children play games and families enjoy picnic lunches. "Feels weird, doesn't it?" Michael said, gesturing toward the crowd. "What does?" Henry asked. "Being part of something bigger. Having roots, I guess." Henry nodded, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder. "It's not about where you come from, son. It's about finding your place in the world and holding on to it tight." Michael looked around, taking in the laughter, music, and camaraderie surrounding them. For the first time, he truly understood what Henry meant. Despite the challenges he'd faced growing up, he'd found a home, not just in the physical sense, but in the people who cared about him. And at the center of it all was Henry. On the anniversary of their reunion, Michael decided to do something special. He surprised Henry with a framed photo collage featuring pictures from the past year, snapshots of them fixing cars, gardening, cooking meals, and attending community events. Beneath the photos, Michael had written a short message. To Dad, thank you for sticking around this time. When Henry unwrapped the gift, tears welled up in his eyes. I don't deserve this, he whispered, tracing the edge of the frame with trembling fingers. Yes, you do, Michael replied firmly. You may have made mistakes in the past, but look at us now. We're proof that second chances are worth fighting for. Henry pulled Michael into a tight hug, overcome with emotion. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The embrace said everything. As life moved forward, Michael continued his work as a police officer, drawing strength from the newfound stability in his personal life. Henry became a regular fixture at the station, often stopping by to chat with officers or help with minor repairs around the building. Their partnership inspired others, serving as a reminder that compassion and understanding can bridge even the widest divides. Late one summer evening, as they sat together on Henry's porch watching the sunset, Michael broke the comfortable silence. You know, I used to think my life was missing something, like I'd never find the answers I needed. Turns out they were right here all along. Henry smiled, patting Michael's knee. Sometimes the answers come when you least expect them. All you have to do is keep your heart open. And so, beneath the vast sky dotted with stars, father and son sat side by side, grateful for the journey that had led them back to each other. They couldn't change the past, but they could shape the future together.